The bitter wind whipped across the snow-covered landscape, cutting through Tommy Jensen's thin jacket like a knife. At just 7 years old, he was hopelessly lost in the vast Alaskan wilderness, miles from the hunting cabin where his father had momentarily stepped away. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Tommy's small body was already trembling uncontrollably. He had wandered only a few hundred yards from the cabin, chasing a snowshoe hare he'd spotted near some pine trees. The playful creature had darted between the trees, and Tommy, fascinated, had followed without thinking. Now, disoriented and scared, he realized he couldn't see the cabin anymore. Snowflakes began falling more heavily, obscuring his vision and covering his tiny footprints. Tommy's fingers were numb, his lips turning a dangerous shade of blue. He had no survival training, no understanding of how quickly hypothermia could claim a child in these unforgiving conditions. Tears froze on his cheeks as he stumbled through the deep snow, his energy rapidly depleting with each labored step. The forest around him grew darker, the temperature continuing to plummet. Tommy was losing hope, his 7-year-old mind understanding only that he was alone, cold and terrified. He could barely feel his feet, and his movements became slower and more uncertain with each passing minute. Then, through the swirling snow, a massive shadow emerged. The Alaskan wilderness in mid-December was unforgiving, a landscape of white and grey that showed no mercy to the unprepared. That particular winter had been especially brutal, with temperatures consistently dropping below -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind chills that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. The region around the Kenai Peninsula was experiencing one of its coldest seasons in recorded history. John Jensen, Tommy's father, was an experienced wilderness guide and hunter who knew these conditions intimately. He had been tracking a small herd of elk that morning, carefully moving through the snow-covered forest with his high-powered rifle slung across his shoulder. The hunting trip was supposed to be a simple day expedition, something he had done countless times before. The weather report that morning had warned of an incoming storm system, but John was confident in his ability to navigate and return before the worst of it hit. He had grown up in these mountains, learning survival skills from his own father and grandfather. The Jensen family had been Alaskan natives for 3 generations, each one intimately connected to the harsh but beautiful landscape. When Tommy had first wandered away, John hadn't immediately panicked. Children were curious, and he had taught his son basic wilderness awareness. But as minutes turned into an hour, and the snowfall began to intensify, a deep sense of dread started to consume him. The forest, which had always been a familiar friend, now felt like a potential tomb. The storm was developing faster than any meteorological prediction. Winds began to howl through the pine forests, creating whiteout conditions that reduced visibility to mere feet. John's experienced eyes scanned the landscape, looking for any sign of his son. His tracking skills, usually impeccable, were being challenged by the rapidly changing environment. Local wildlife was also sensing the approaching severe weather. Elk herds were moving to lower elevations, foxes were seeking deep burrows, and even the hardiest mountain creatures were preparing for survival. The ecosystem was preparing for a brutal assault of winter's most extreme conditions. John's emergency radio crackled with warnings from the local ranger station. They were recommending all hunters and wilderness travelers to seek immediate shelter. The incoming storm was predicted to be one of the most severe in decades, with potential wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour and temperatures that could drop to -50. His survival pack contained essential gear: a satellite phone, emergency beacon, thermal blankets, high-calorie rations, and advanced navigation tools, but none of that mattered if he couldn't find Tommy. The father in him was now completely overriding the professional wilderness guide, his heart racing with each passing minute. As the storm intensified, John knew the window for finding his son was rapidly closing. Hypothermia could set in quickly for a small child, and the chances of survival were diminishing with each passing hour. The vast, white landscape seemed to mock his desperate search, hiding any potential trace of Tommy's path. Little did John know that at that very moment, something extraordinary was unfolding in the snow-covered forest. A survival scenario that would become legend in the small Alaskan community. a tale of unexpected protection and primal connection that defied all logical explanation. The storm continued to rage, nature's fury unleashed in its most brutal form, setting the stage for a remarkable encounter that would challenge everything John understood about wilderness survival and the unexpected bonds between humans and the wild. The massive Kodiak bear had been foraging near the edge of the forest when the first signs of the approaching storm caught its attention. Unlike most creatures that would seek immediate shelter, this particular bear, a mature male in his prime, seemed unusually alert and restless. Tommy Jensen, just 6 years old, had no concept of the danger surrounding him. His small body, dressed in a bright red winter jacket and insulated snow pants, was already showing signs of severe cold exposure. He had wandered away from his father's hunting camp, initially fascinated by a small rabbit trail, then quickly becoming disoriented in the rapidly changing weather conditions. The child's movements were becoming increasingly sluggish. His initial curiosity and excitement had given way to confusion and fear. The snowfall was thick and relentless, creating a whiteout environment that obscured any familiar landmarks. Tommy's small, mittened hands were turning pale, a dangerous sign of approaching hypothermia. The Kodiak bear, approximately 1,500 pounds of pure wilderness survival expertise, moved with an unusual purposefulness. Most bears would be deep in hibernation at this time of year, but this particular male had been a late hibernator, still hunting for final winter provisions. Something about the small, vulnerable human caught its attention, not as prey, but with an almost inexplicable sense of recognition. Bears are known for their remarkable sensory capabilities. This one seemed to detect the child's distress in a way that transcended typical predator-prey dynamics. As Tommy stumbled through the snow, his movements becoming more erratic and weak, the bear began to track him, not to hunt, but seemingly to protect. The child's core body temperature was dropping rapidly. He had been exposed to the extreme cold for nearly 2 hours, and his small body was losing its ability to generate heat. His lips were turning blue, and his movements were becoming increasingly uncoordinated, classic signs of severe hypothermia. When the bear finally approached, it did so with a deliberate, almost cautious manner. Most human encounters with wild bears would result in immediate terror, but this was different. The massive creature moved closer, its breath creating visible steam in the freezing air. Tommy, too cold and confused to feel fear, simply looked up with glazed, unfocused eyes. The bear did something extraordinary. Instead of presenting a threat, it positioned its massive body around the child, creating a living windbreak. Its thick fur and enormous body mass began to generate heat, providing a crucial barrier against the brutal wind and snow. The child, instinctively sensing warmth, pressed closer to the bear's side. This was no gentle domesticated animal, but a wild Kodiak bear, one of the largest land predators in North America. Yet something in its behavior suggested an almost protective instinct. It adjusted its position, ensuring the child was completely sheltered from the wind, its massive form creating a cocoon of survival. Hours passed. The storm raged, transforming the landscape into a white wilderness of extreme conditions. The bear remained motionless, its body heat slowly counteracting the deadly cold, threatening the child's survival. Tommy, semi-conscious, was kept alive by this unexpected guardian. Local wildlife experts would later struggle to explain this behavior. Bears are not known for interspecies protection, especially with humans. This was an anomaly that defied standard biological understanding. Some would suggest it was a rare moment of cross-species empathy, while others would dismiss it as an impossible tale. As the storm began to subside, the bear remained vigilant. Its massive form had created a small depression in the snow, a makeshift shelter that had preserved the child's life. When rescue teams would eventually find Tommy, they would discover him alive, barely, but miraculously surviving what should have been fatal exposure. The bear, by the time rescuers arrived, had disappeared into the wilderness, leaving behind nothing but a remarkable story of survival that would become local legend, a tale of unexpected protection that challenged everything people understood about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Tommy's survival would be attributed to an extraordinary combination of wilderness survival skills and what could only be described as a miraculous intervention. The rescue team's arrival was nothing short of miraculous. Led by veteran wilderness tracker Jack Holloway, the search party had been combing the Alaskan wilderness for nearly 36 hours when they discovered Tommy. The child was barely alive, his body temperature dangerously low, his skin a pale bluish white that spoke of near-fatal exposure. Immediate medical assessment revealed the extraordinary nature of Tommy's survival. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead physician at Anchorage General Hospital's emergency trauma unit, would later describe Tommy's condition as
medically inexplicable.
Standard survival charts suggested that a child exposed to such extreme conditions should have succumbed to hypothermia within hours. Yet here he was, alive, though critically ill. The initial medical intervention was intense. Tommy was rushed into a specialized hypothermia treatment unit, where carefully controlled warming techniques would be crucial to his survival. Doctors used advanced warming blankets, intravenous warm saline solutions, and continuous monitoring to slowly bring his core body temperature back to normal. Each degree of temperature increase was a battle against potential organ failure. Tommy's father, Mark Jensen, a seasoned wilderness guide himself, was inconsolable. The hunting trip had been meant to be a bonding experience, a chance to teach his son about survival, about the harsh but beautiful Alaskan wilderness. Instead, it had nearly become a tragedy. Mark blamed himself entirely, replaying the moments before Tommy's disappearance over and over in his mind. The medical team discovered something extraordinary during their initial examinations. Despite the extreme exposure, Tommy had remarkably few signs of severe frostbite. While most children in similar circumstances would have lost fingers, toes, or suffered extensive tissue damage, Tommy's extremities showed minimal injury. It was as if something, or someone, had protected him during those critical hours. Interviews with the rescue team painted an increasingly mysterious picture. Jack Holloway, a man with over 30 years of wilderness rescue experience, spoke of unusual tracks near where Tommy was found. Large bear prints, but arranged in a pattern that suggested something more than typical predatory behavior.
In all my years,
Holloway would later tell investigators,
I've never seen anything quite like it.
Tommy's recovery was slow but steady. For weeks, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his young body fighting to heal. Psychological evaluations revealed something equally fascinating. When Tommy began to speak about his experience, his descriptions were fragmented but consistent. He spoke of a
big warm friend
who had protected him during the storm. Initial psychiatric assessments suggested these were likely hallucinations, a common response to extreme trauma. But Tommy's descriptions were too specific, too detailed to be dismissed entirely. He could describe the texture of thick fur, the warmth of a massive body, the way the wind seemed to stop around him during the worst of the storm. Mark Jensen struggled with the emotional aftermath. The hunting trip that was meant to be a father-son bonding experience had transformed into a nightmare of guilt and miraculous survival. He spent countless hours by Tommy's hospital bed, wrestling with the near loss of his child and the inexplicable circumstances of his rescue. Medical specialists from around the country began to take an interest in Tommy's case. Dr. Rodriguez compiled extensive medical documentation, believing the case could provide unprecedented insights into human survival mechanisms. Tommy became something of a medical marvel, a child who had survived conditions that should have been fatal. As weeks turned into months, Tommy's recovery continued to defy medical expectations. Physical therapy revealed no long-term neurological damage. His body showed remarkable resilience, with healing processes that seemed accelerated beyond normal childhood recovery rates. Doctors began to wonder if the extraordinary circumstances of his survival had triggered something unique in his physiological response. The local native Alaskan community offered a different perspective. Elder storytellers spoke of ancient legends about bears as protectors, about spiritual connections between humans and wilderness creatures. While scientific minds dismissed such narratives, There was something about Tommy's story that seemed to transcend conventional understanding. Psychological follow-up revealed another fascinating dimension. Tommy developed an unusual affinity for wilderness environments, where most children might develop a fear of the outdoors after such a traumatic experience. Tommy showed an almost magnetic attraction to wild spaces. He would spend hours looking at wildlife documentaries, showing a particular fascination with bear behavior. By his 10th birthday, Tommy had become something of a local legend. Rescue teams, medical professionals, and wilderness experts would gather to hear the story of the boy who survived the impossible. Each retelling seemed to add another layer of mystery to an already extraordinary tale. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning of a story that would take decades to fully unfold. A story of survival, connection, and an unexpected debt that would eventually be repaid in the most surprising way imaginable. Tommy's recovery was a complex journey of physical healing and emotional adaptation. The Jensen family dynamics shifted dramatically in the wake of his miraculous survival. Mark Jensen, consumed by guilt, became overprotective, constantly monitoring Tommy's health and development. His wife Sarah oscillated between relief and anxiety, watching their son with a mixture of wonder and deep maternal concern. Medical specialists conducted extensive tests throughout Tommy's childhood. Each examination revealed subtle but significant differences in his physiological makeup. His immune system was remarkably robust, showing resistance to illnesses that typically affected children his age. Doctors noted unusual cellular regeneration patterns that defied standard medical understanding. As Tommy grew, he struggled with the weight of his extraordinary survival story. School became challenging. Other children would whisper and stare, creating a sense of isolation. He was simultaneously treated as a miracle and an oddity. Psychologists recommended specialized counseling to help him process the trauma and the constant attention. Mark Jensen's wilderness expertise became both a blessing and a curse. He couldn't stop himself from teaching Tommy extreme survival techniques, driven by a deep-seated need to ensure his son would never be vulnerable again. Sarah often intervened, worried that these lessons were more about Mark's guilt than Tommy's actual needs. The medical bills were overwhelming. Despite insurance and local community support, the specialized treatments and continuous monitoring created significant financial strain. Mark took additional jobs, working longer hours as a wilderness guide and taking on extra consulting work to cover the medical expenses. Tommy's relationship with his parents became increasingly complex. He sensed their underlying anxiety, their constant fear of losing him again. This created a subtle tension in their home, love mixed with an undercurrent of unresolved trauma. Family therapy sessions became a regular part of their life, helping them navigate the emotional landscape of their shared experience. By middle school, Tommy had developed a unique perspective on survival. He was neither afraid nor overly confident. Instead, he possessed a calm, almost detached understanding of human vulnerability. His teachers noted his unusual maturity, his ability to remain composed in situations that would typically upset other children. Medical records became a constant companion. Each year brought new assessments, new theories about his remarkable recovery. Tommy learned to view his body as a subject of scientific curiosity, sometimes feeling more like a case study than a normal child. This detachment became both his protection and his burden. The local medical community watched Tommy's development with intense interest. Research papers were written, conferences discussed his case, and he became an unintentional medical phenomenon. Dr. Rodriguez, who had first treated him, continued to track his progress, seeing in him something beyond a typical patient. As Tommy approached adolescence, the physical reminders of his wilderness survival began to fade. The scars, both physical and emotional, became less prominent, but the underlying mystery of his survival remained, a constant whisper in the background of his family's life, waiting to be fully understood. The psychological landscape of Tommy's survival was a complex terrain, marked by layers of trauma, resilience, and an inexplicable connection to the wilderness that had both saved and fundamentally altered him. From his earliest memories, Tommy experienced vivid nightmares that defied typical childhood dream patterns. These weren't simple terror-filled episodes, but intricate, almost documentary-like recollections of his near-death experience in the Alaskan wilderness. He would wake up with a visceral sense of cold, the phantom sensation of fur against his skin, and an overwhelming smell of pine and wilderness that seemed to permeate his bedroom. Dr. Elena Martinez, the child psychologist assigned to his case, discovered something extraordinary during her initial evaluations. Tommy's trauma response was fundamentally different from other children who had experienced life-threatening situations. Where most survivors showed heightened anxiety or extreme fear, Tommy displayed a curious detachment, a psychological mechanism that seemed more adaptive than defensive. In therapy sessions, he would describe his wilderness experience with a clinical precision that was deeply unsettling. He spoke about the bear not as a terrifying predator, but as a complex entity that had made a conscious choice to protect him. This perspective challenged traditional psychological understanding of survival trauma. Dr. Martinez began documenting his case, recognizing that Tommy represented a unique psychological study. School became a challenging environment for Tommy. His peers couldn't comprehend the depth of his experience, and he struggled to form meaningful connections. He was simultaneously too mature for his age and emotionally disconnected. Teachers noted his exceptional ability to remain calm during stressful situations, a trait that set him apart from other children. The psychological impact extended beyond Tommy's personal experience. His parents underwent significant emotional transformation. Mark Jensen developed an almost obsessive interest in wilderness survival techniques, channeling his unresolved guilt into preparing his son for potential future challenges. Sarah, meanwhile, oscillated between protective instincts and a deep-seated fear of losing Tommy again. Interestingly, Tommy developed an extraordinary sensory awareness that seemed connected to his survival experience. He could detect subtle environmental changes with an almost preternatural sensitivity. Weather shifts, animal movements, even minute atmospheric pressure changes. He perceived them with a clarity that medical professionals found inexplicable. Nighttime brought the most profound psychological manifestations. Tommy would often sit by his window, staring into the darkness, displaying a connection to the wilderness that went beyond normal childhood curiosity. His parents would find him in these moments, silent and still, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Psychological testing revealed unique neural pathways in Tommy's brain. Standard cognitive assessments failed to capture the complexity of his mental landscape. Dr. Martinez collaborated with neurologists and trauma specialists, creating a comprehensive profile that challenged existing understanding of survival psychology. The bear encounter had fundamentally rewired Tommy's psychological response mechanisms. Where most children would develop post-traumatic stress disorder, Tommy had developed what researchers began calling
Adaptive trauma response.
a psychological state that transformed potential psychological damage into a heightened survival mechanism. As he entered adolescence, Tommy's psychological complexity became more pronounced. He showed an extraordinary ability to read environmental and social situations with a depth that seemed beyond his years. Survival wasn't just a past experience for him, it had become a fundamental way of perceiving the world. Group therapy sessions designed for childhood trauma survivors proved challenging. Tommy's experience was so unique that traditional therapeutic approaches seemed inadequate. He would often sit silently, observing other children's stories with a detached curiosity that both intrigued and unsettled professional therapists. His relationship with nature became his primary psychological outlet. Hiking, tracking animal movements, understanding wilderness dynamics, these became more than hobbies. They were a form of communication, a way of processing the profound experience that had defined his early childhood. Psychological professionals began to see Tommy not as a victim of a traumatic experience, but as a unique case study of human adaptability. His mind had transformed a potentially fatal encounter into a complex psychological adaptation that defied traditional understanding of survival mechanisms. The bear that had saved him was more than a memory. It had become a psychological anchor, a mysterious connection that Tommy couldn't fully explain but could never fully escape. Tommy's childhood and adolescent years were a tapestry of extraordinary experiences, marked by his unique background and the lingering impact of his wilderness survival. Growing up in a small Alaskan town, Tommy was never quite like other children. His early school years were characterized by a sense of otherness that he couldn't fully articulate. While his classmates were preoccupied with typical childhood concerns, Tommy carried a depth of experience that set him apart. His classmates would talk about video games and cartoons, while he would be more interested in discussing survival techniques, animal behavior, and the intricate ecosystems of the Alaskan wilderness. Elementary school was particularly challenging. Teachers struggled to understand Tommy's unique perspective. During nature studies, he would offer insights that seemed far beyond his years. Once, during a third-grade science project about local wildlife, Tommy provided such detailed information about bear behavior that his teacher initially suspected he had copied from an advanced textbook. A subsequent investigation revealed that his knowledge came from personal experience and an intuitive understanding that defied traditional learning methods. His physical education experiences were equally distinctive. While other children struggled with basic outdoor activities, Tommy moved with a grace and confidence that seemed almost supernatural. During wilderness field trips, he became the unofficial guide, demonstrating survival skills that left both teachers and classmates in awe. He could start a fire with minimal resources, identify edible plants, and navigate through challenging terrain with an ease that seemed impossible for a child his age. Social interactions presented constant challenges. Tommy's peers found him simultaneously fascinating and intimidating. He didn't engage in typical childhood play. Instead, he observed, analyzed, and occasionally participated with a level of strategic thinking that was uncommon in children. Birthday parties, school events, and group activities became complex social experiments for him, where he would carefully navigate interactions with a calculated approach. Middle school brought additional complexities. Puberty and social dynamics added layers of challenge to Tommy's already unique existence. While other boys were becoming interested in sports and video games, Tommy was developing a profound connection with the natural world. His bedroom walls were covered with detailed maps, wildlife photographs, and survival guides rather than posters of pop culture icons. His relationship with technology was particularly interesting. Unlike most of his peers who were constantly connected to smartphones and social media, Tommy viewed digital devices with a detached curiosity. He understood their functionality but seemed more interested in the natural world's communication systems. He could spend hours tracking animal movements or studying weather patterns, finding more excitement in a bird's migration route than in the latest viral internet trend. Athletic pursuits took on a different meaning for Tommy. While other children joined traditional sports teams, he was more interested in activities that tested survival skills. Rock climbing, wilderness trekking, and outdoor survival courses became his preferred physical activities. He excelled in these areas with a natural ability that seemed to stem from his early wilderness experience. Family dynamics were complex. His parents, Mark and Sarah, oscillated between treating him as a normal child and recognizing his extraordinary background. They sought a delicate balance between protecting him and allowing him to develop his unique capabilities. Family vacations became opportunities for Tommy to demonstrate his skills, often leaving tour guides and local experts impressed by his knowledge and intuition. High school brought both challenges and opportunities. Tommy's academic performance was exceptional, but not in a traditional sense. He wasn't simply a good student. He was a unique learner who approached education with a holistic, experiential perspective. Science classes became platforms for him to share insights that often surprised his teachers. His biology and environmental science teachers quickly recognized that he was more than just a student. He was a potential researcher with an extraordinary perspective. Romantic relationships were particularly challenging for Tommy. His emotional landscape was so different from his peers that traditional teenage dating seemed almost comical to him. He approached potential relationships with the same analytical approach he used in wilderness survival, observing, calculating, and making strategic decisions. This approach often left potential romantic partners confused and somewhat intimidated. Extracurricular activities took on a unique form for Tommy. While other students joined debate clubs or sports teams, he became involved with local conservation groups and wilderness preservation organizations. By the time he was 16, he had already contributed to several research projects about Alaskan wildlife and ecosystem preservation. His reputation in the local community became somewhat legendary. People would share stories about the
Wilderness boy.
the child who had survived an impossible situation and seemed to carry the essence of the wild within him. Local outdoor enthusiasts and wilderness guides would seek his advice, recognizing that his knowledge came from a place beyond traditional learning. As he approached adulthood, Tommy began to understand that his early survival experience was more than just a traumatic event. It was a transformative moment that had fundamentally shaped his entire existence. The bear that had saved him was no longer just a memory, but a profound metaphor for his approach to life, survival, adaptation, and an unbreakable connection with the natural world. The unexpected connection to wilderness. Tommy's connection to the wilderness was far more profound than anyone could have anticipated. It wasn't just a passive relationship or a casual interest. It was a deep, almost spiritual bond that seemed to transcend ordinary human experience. As he entered his early 20s, Tommy began to realize that his survival experience wasn't just a childhood incident, but a defining moment that would shape his entire life's trajectory. His understanding of the natural world went beyond academic knowledge or professional expertise. It was an intrinsic connection that seemed to pulse through his very being. After completing a degree in environmental science at the University of Alaska, Tommy found himself drawn to more unconventional career paths. Traditional research positions felt constraining. Instead, he began working with indigenous communities in remote Alaskan regions, documenting traditional wilderness knowledge and conservation techniques. His ability to communicate with local elders was remarkable. Where most researchers struggled to gain trust, Tommy seemed to speak a language that went beyond words. One particularly transformative experience occurred during a research expedition to the most remote regions of the Alaskan wilderness. What began as a standard ecological survey quickly became something extraordinary. Tommy was documenting wildlife migration patterns when he encountered a situation that would challenge everything he understood about human-nature interactions. During a particularly challenging week-long expedition, his team encountered a series of unprecedented environmental challenges. A sudden and severe storm system moved in, creating conditions that would have been fatal to most researchers. While his colleagues struggled with equipment and survival, Tommy moved through the landscape with an almost supernatural ease. He anticipated weather changes before they occurred, found shelter in locations that seemed impossible to detect, and maintained a calm that bordered on the inexplicable. His team members began to whisper about his abilities. It wasn't just skill or training. There was something more profound happening. One team member, Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, a veteran environmental researcher, became particularly fascinated by Tommy's capabilities. She began documenting his interactions with the environment, noting how he seemed to communicate with the landscape in ways that defied scientific explanation. During one critical moment, Tommy located a rare wolf pack that researchers had been trying to track for months. But it wasn't just about finding them. He seemed to understand their movement patterns, their social dynamics, and their environmental interactions in a way that went beyond traditional wildlife research. The wolves didn't just tolerate his presence. They seemed to recognize him as something more than a typical human observer. His connection extended beyond wildlife. Tommy developed an extraordinary ability to predict environmental changes. He could sense subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure, understand complex ecological interactions, and anticipate natural events with a precision that left scientific colleagues both impressed and slightly unnerved. Local indigenous communities began to seek his counsel, recognizing that his understanding went beyond academic knowledge. A breakthrough came during a critical conservation project involving the preservation of a unique ecosystem in the Alaskan interior. Tommy's research revealed complex interdependencies that traditional scientific methods had overlooked. His approach combined indigenous knowledge, personal experience, and scientific methodology in a way that was revolutionary. The wilderness seemed to respond to Tommy differently. Where most researchers collected data, he established relationships. Wildlife would behave differently around him. Predators that would typically avoid human presence would approach with a curious caution. Birds would alter their flight patterns, seemingly communicating something beyond human comprehension. His personal life became increasingly intertwined with his environmental work. Traditional relationships felt challenging. Most potential partners couldn't understand the depth of his connection to the natural world. He wasn't just passionate about environmental conservation. He was fundamentally part of the ecosystem in a way that defied conventional understanding. Research institutions began to take notice. Funding opportunities emerged that allowed Tommy to pursue increasingly complex research projects. He wasn't just studying the wilderness, he was developing a new paradigm of understanding human interaction with natural environments. A pivotal moment came during a challenging expedition to document climate change impacts in the most remote regions of Alaska, while other researchers collected data through technological means. Tommy seemed to absorb information through an almost intuitive connection. He could walk through a landscape and understand its entire ecological history, its current challenges, and potential future transformations. His work began to attract international attention. Scientific journals published his groundbreaking research, which challenged existing paradigms of environmental understanding. Tommy wasn't just a researcher. He was becoming a bridge between traditional scientific methodology and a more holistic understanding of ecological interactions. The connection to the wilderness that began with that miraculous bear encounter in his childhood had transformed into something far more significant. It was as if that single moment of survival had planted a seed that would grow into a revolutionary approach to understanding human-nature relationships. As he approached his 30th year, Tommy realized that his life's work was about more than environmental research. He was developing a new language of ecological understanding, a way of perceiving the natural world that went beyond traditional scientific boundaries. The wilderness was no longer just a subject of study. It was home. It was family. It was a living, breathing entity that he was intrinsically connected to in ways that most humans could never comprehend. The chance encounter in remote location. The Denali wilderness stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of white and green under the late summer sky. Tommy Jensen had been tracking a wolf pack for 3 days, his specialized research equipment carefully packed but mostly untouched. Something about this expedition felt different from his previous expeditions. On the 4th morning, as mist rolled across the alpine meadow, he first noticed the unusual tracks. They weren't wolf prints, nor were they typical bear markings. Something was tracking him, moving with a deliberate precision that suggested intelligence beyond typical predatory behavior. By midday, the feeling of being watched had become overwhelming. Tommy stopped, adjusted his GPS, and scanned the surrounding landscape. That's when he saw him, an older man standing approximately 200 yards away, dressed in weathered wilderness gear that looked decades old. The man's stance was familiar. Not just familiar, it was identical to a posture Tommy remembered from childhood. A memory so distant it felt like a dream. A memory of survival, of a bear, of being saved. As their eyes met across the wilderness expanse, Tommy felt a surge of recognition that transcended rational understanding. The man didn't move. He simply watched, a knowing smile playing across his weathered face. Something extraordinary was about to unfold. Unraveling of mysterious connection. Tommy's heart raced as the older man approached, each step deliberate and measured. The wilderness around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something momentous to unfold.
You don't recognize me completely, do you?
The man said, his voice gravelly but warm. He extended a hand weathered by decades of outdoor life, revealing a distinctive scar that Tommy remembered from childhood. A scar he had always associated with his miraculous survival. 42 years earlier, Tommy had been a 6-year-old lost in the Alaskan wilderness during a brutal winter storm. His family's camping trip had gone terribly wrong when he had wandered away from their campsite, getting disoriented in the rapidly falling snow. What should have been a certain death sentence became a miraculous story of survival that had puzzled medical professionals and wilderness experts for decades. The man introduced himself as Jack Harrington, a retired wildlife conservation officer who had been tracking animal movements in the region during that fateful winter of 1981. As he began to speak, fragments of a long-forgotten memory started to crystallize in Tommy's mind.
I wasn't supposed to be in that part of the wilderness that day.
Jack explained, pulling out an old, worn notebook from his backpack.
My regular patrol route had been changed due to a reported grizzly bear activity near a different sector. But something told me to check this area.
Tommy listened, transfixed. Jack described how he had discovered Tommy nearly frozen, curled up next to an unusually large male grizzly bear. The bear hadn't attacked or eaten the child, as would be expected. Instead, it had seemingly been protecting him, providing warmth and shelter. Medical records from Tommy's subsequent hospitalization had always been mysterious. Doctors couldn't explain how a 6-year-old had survived temperatures that would have killed an adult, let alone a child. His body temperature had been dangerously low, but not fatal. His exposure time should have resulted in severe frostbite, yet he had emerged with minimal damage. Jack pulled out photographs, some official documentation, others personal snapshots from wildlife surveys. Each image told a piece of the puzzle. There were tracking reports, wildlife movement logs, and most intriguingly, several blurry photographs of a specific grizzly bear that seemed to have an unusual behavioral pattern.
The bear wasn't just random,
Jack said quietly.
It was a specific male, about 12 years old at the time. We tracked its movements for years after your incident. Its behavior was unusual.
Tommy's professional background as a wildlife researcher made him acutely aware of how extraordinary this narrative was. Bears didn't typically interact with humans, especially children, in a protective manner. Everything about this story defied conventional understanding of animal behavior. As Jack continued to unravel the details, Tommy realized this was more than just a chance encounter. It was a deliberate meeting, decades in the making. The mysterious connection between a lost child, an unexpected protector, and the wilderness itself was about to reveal its deepest secrets. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the alpine landscape. Tommy and Jack sat together, 2 generations connected by an inexplicable moment of survival, ready to piece together a story that would challenge everything known about human-animal interactions. Little did they know, the most shocking revelations were yet to come. Life-changing moments of recognition. The Mountain Research Station stood like a sentinel against the rugged Alaskan landscape, its weathered wooden structure a testament to decades of scientific observation. Tommy Rodriguez had spent the last 15 years of his professional life studying wildlife behavior, specializing in large predator interactions, a path ironically shaped by his own miraculous childhood survival. Dr. Elena Martinez, the station's lead researcher, watched Tommy carefully as he reviewed the latest tracking data. Something about his demeanor had changed since returning from his recent wilderness expedition. The photographs and field notes he'd brought back weren't just another research collection, they were personal.
These bear movement patterns are extraordinary,
Tommy muttered, spreading out a series of thermal imaging prints and GPS tracking logs. His fingers traced the intricate lines of bear movements, pausing repeatedly at a specific set of coordinates that seemed to hold more than just scientific significance. The tracking data revealed something unprecedented. A male grizzly, now elderly by bear standards, had been consistently moving through a specific mountain corridor for decades. Its behavior defied typical territorial patterns. Most bears would have long since altered their range, yet this particular bear seemed almost intentional in its movements. Elena noticed Tommy's hands trembling slightly.
Is everything all right?
She asked, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of computer equipment and distant mountain wind. Tommy took a deep breath.
Remember the story I've told you about my survival as a child? The bear that somehow kept me alive during that impossible winter?
His voice was different, less scientific, more personal. The story was legendary within wildlife research circles. A 6-year-old boy found alive after 36 hours in sub-zero temperatures, miraculously protected by a large male grizzly bear. Medical records showed Tommy should have died from hypothermia, yet he survived with minimal long-term effects. What made the story even more extraordinary was the complete absence of typical predator-prey dynamics. The bear hadn't just accidentally been near Tommy, it had actively protected him.
The tracking data
Tommy continued.
matches something Jack Harrington showed me. A bear with an almost identical movement pattern to the one that saved me decades ago.
Elena leaned closer. Tommy rarely spoke about his childhood incident with such intensity. His usual scientific detachment was replaced by something raw and emotional.
I've spent my entire career trying to understand animal behavior.
Tommy said, his voice cracking slightly.
But this is different. This bear didn't just accidentally save me, it chose to save me.
The research station's large windows overlooked a vast wilderness that seemed to hold countless untold stories. Mountain peaks stretched endlessly, their snow-capped surfaces reflecting late afternoon sunlight. It was a landscape that held secrets, much like the bear that had become the central mystery of Tommy's life. Forensic analysis of the original incident had never fully explained the bear's behavior. Wildlife experts had theories: maternal instinct, territorial protection, random chance, but nothing conclusive. Tommy's survival remained an anomaly that challenged everything known about predator behavior.
I want to find this bear.
Tommy said suddenly.
Not just through data and tracking, but physically. I need to understand why.
Elena understood the weight of this statement. For Tommy, this was more than research. This was a personal quest that had defined his entire professional and emotional trajectory. The tracking data told a story of its own. The bear, now an elder of its species, had maintained an almost ritualistic movement pattern through a specific mountain range. Its range hadn't significantly changed in decades, unlike typical bear populations that constantly shifted territories. As sunset painted the mountain landscape in deep oranges and purples, Tommy realized he was standing at the precipice of something extraordinary. The connection between a child and a wild animal wasn't just a miraculous story. It was a profound, unexplained bond that defied scientific understanding. Something was calling him back to the wilderness, and this time he was going to uncover the truth. Profound human-nature relationship twist. The expedition was meticulously planned, but nothing could have prepared Tommy Rodriguez for what he would discover deep in the Alaskan wilderness. His team of 3 experienced wildlife researchers, Elena Martinez, Jack Harrington, and local wilderness guide Sarah Kincaid, represented decades of combined expertise in predator behavior and mountain survival. Their base camp sat nestled in a remote valley, surrounded by towering spruce forests and rocky outcroppings that seemed to touch the steel-grey sky. Advanced tracking equipment, satellite communications, and years of research data supported their mission to understand the extraordinary behavioral pattern of an aging male grizzly bear that had captured Tommy's obsession. On the 3rd night of their expedition, something changed. The thermal imaging cameras captured an anomaly that defied everything they understood about bear behavior. The elderly grizzly, which Tommy had nicknamed
Guardian.
based on his childhood memories, wasn't just moving through the territory, it was deliberately positioning itself, almost as if it was waiting for something.
Look at this.
Tommy said, spreading out the digital images for the team to examine. The bear's movements were calculated, precise, nothing like the random wanderings typical of aging predators. Jack Harrington, a veteran wildlife biologist with 30 years of field experience, leaned in closer.
This isn't random.
He muttered.
It's like the bear knows we're here.
Sarah Kincaid, whose indigenous Alaskan heritage gave her a unique perspective on wildlife interactions, remained unusually quiet. Her grandmother's stories about animal spirits and deep connections between humans and nature seemed to echo in her thoughtful silence. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a late-night data review. Eleanor discovered something extraordinary in the genetic analysis they'd been conducting. DNA samples from hair and tissue collected over the years revealed a genetic marker that was almost impossible to explain. The bear showed genetic characteristics that suggested an unprecedented level of adaptive behavior, as if its entire biological structure had been subtly modified by a singular, profound experience.
This is impossible.
Eleanor whispered, running the genetic sequencing multiple times to confirm her findings. The bear's DNA carried markers that suggested a heightened neurological response, specifically in areas related to protective instinct and emotional recognition. It was as if the bear's encounter with Tommy decades ago had fundamentally altered its genetic programming. Tommy's childhood survival was no longer just a miraculous story. It was becoming a scientific phenomenon that challenged everything known about animal behavior and interspecies communication. As dawn broke on the 5th day of their expedition, the unexpected happened. The bear appeared, not as a distant, threatening presence, but as a deliberate, almost calculated visitor to their research camp. Its movements were slow, calculated. Unlike typical predator approaches, this bear seemed to be communicating. Sarah Kincaid's reaction was the most profound.
It's not hunting.
She said quietly.
It's trying to tell us something.
The bear stopped approximately 200 meters from their camp, positioning itself in a way that was unmistakably intentional. Its gaze seemed to lock directly with Tommy's, creating a moment of connection that transcended scientific understanding. Hours of observation revealed something extraordinary. The bear wasn't displaying typical territorial behavior. Instead, it seemed to be presenting something, a series of movements that felt like a complex, deliberate message. Jack Harrington's scientific skepticism began to crack.
I've never seen anything like this in 40 years of research,
He admitted, his voice a mixture of wonder and professional disbelief. Tommy's childhood memories began to flood back, fragments of that impossible winter night when this same bear had somehow kept him alive. What had seemed like a random act of survival now felt like something much more profound. The research team captured hours of footage, collected extensive data, and documented every moment. But none of their scientific instruments could capture the true essence of what was happening, a connection that defied rational explanation. As the expedition continued, the bear's presence became a constant, not threatening, but watchful. It was as if decades of unspoken connection were finally finding expression. What Tommy would ultimately discover would challenge not just scientific understanding, but the very concept of how living beings communicate and connect across seemingly insurmountable boundaries. The wilderness held its breath, waiting for the truth to be revealed.